Spacefarer. Hey, what's up? I'm Caleb. This is WTUFO, and we have conversations with interesting people about UFOs. So if you like the topic, throw us a like and subscribe. That'll help the algorithm tell other people we exist. Hope you enjoy the episode, and have a great day. Lucky UFO, I'm here with Dr. Stephen Bruehl. Stephen, it's great to meet you. Thank you so much for joining me.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Stephen has exploded onto the scene recently with the publication of two extremely exciting papers, Transients in the Palomar Observatory Sky Survey, may be associated with nuclear testing and reports of unidentified anomalous phenomena. Great catchy headline. And aligned multiple transient events in the first Palomar Sky Survey. So you are a contributor on both of these papers with Beatriz Villaroel and others, especially in the aligned multiple transient events paper. You've got a whole bunch of collaborators. So we understand that you're a part of a team. We're really excited to talk about these papers, and get into some nitty-gritty details and help people learn about how to talk about them. And also, for me, selfishly clarify some of the details so I know that I understand what you have found. But first, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about where you're coming from a career perspective and a scientific training perspective. We understand, we were just talking offline, that you're a professor of anesthesiology at Vanderbilt University. And you also said you had some training in psychiatry. Is that right?
I'm a PhD clinical psychologist by training.
Wow.
And when you get a PhD, one of the things they do is they teach you how to do research. So I got a lot of training in research methodology, statistics, and have spent most of my career doing biomedical research, like NIH, National Institute of Health funded research. Nobody gets trained to do UAP research. So all I've done is taken the skills that I had developed for other reasons and trying to apply them to the UAP topic, which frankly was very hard to do. I couldn't figure out what data to use. I didn't really have anything to work with. And at the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies meeting back in 2024, one of the talks there was Beatriz Villaroel, it was a remote talk, but she was talking about these transients that both of those papers are addressing. And when I was listening to her, I had an idea for statistical analysis we might be able to do if she was up for it. And I reached out to her via email, and eventually she responded. And we had a Zoom call and talked about it. And she liked the idea. So we started partnering on this, the nuclear paper, about a year ago, I guess. And it took a while to get it going, but once we got the data set together and I analyzed it, it was very clear that we had to write up the results because I found them pretty astounding.
So this nuclear paper with the statistical claims about appearance of the transients relating to nuclear testing and UAP, that's you and Beatriz, just you're the two writers on that. And then
Yes.
The aligned multiple transients paper, you're one of maybe 10 writers. Is that right?
Correct. And she brought me into that second paper because she had not gotten it written to a point where she was confident in sending it into a journal. And once we knew the results of the nuclear study, she realized that that was actually nice support for some of the things she was talking about in the aligned transients paper. And it really, that aligned transients paper, there are really two main points to that are relevant to this discussion, because all the critics say that transients are things like dust or scratches on the photographic plate that had the image of the stars, or it's an emulsion defect, or it's radioactive contamination due to radioactivity in the sky that was just ambient at the time because of all the above ground nuclear tests being done, or that they're prosaic astronomical objects like gamma ray bursts and things like that. And I'm not an astronomer by training, but I know that Beatriz and her colleagues have taken seriously all of those criticisms. And, in terms of like gamma ray bursts and things like that, she's come up with good explanations for why the transients can't be that. But what was really interesting was that aligned transients paper did two things that make it pretty likely, or very likely, that transients are actually objects in orbit and show signs of being controlled in some way. And essentially what she did is, if we assume that transients are just some random objects in the sky, then if you've got, several transients in the same image, you would expect them to be randomly distributed, right? They would just be all over the place. They wouldn't form any particular shape. And what she found was that statistically, it was very unlikely that what she was observing would be due to chance, because she was seeing 3, 4, or in some cases, I think even 5 transients in the same image that are lined up in a line, and objects that are meteorites or, something small in orbit that's natural don't line up like that.
They would
So
create a streak. Just to hop in, I need to clarify that for myself. A meteor would look like a straight line, uninterrupted. Is that right?
Yes. Well, with one exception. So
okay.
There's something called geosynchronous orbit, which is about 22,000 miles away from the Earth. And if you're in an orbit at that height, you will stay exactly over the same place where the Earth is. And if I took a picture, even of a natural object that's that far out, it would look like a point, right? It would look like the stars. Now, that takes a lot of energy to get something up to that orbit and to keep it there. And, just with random natural objects, what you would expect is they wouldn't be in that orbit and wouldn't stay at a stable speed. So yes, if it's an object at a lower orbit, or it's not exactly staying at the same speed, what you would see over a 50-minute exposure is a streak, right? It's just like when you take a picture with your camera in low light and the shutter's a little slow, everything looks blurry. So that's basically the same type of effect you get. So it's point sources, multiple ones lining up statistically, way more than chance that they're lining up in lines. And when we had submitted it and got critiques back from the initial reviewers, one of the reviewers, who was very skeptical that transients were anything but natural objects, said, if transients are reflective, you should see a big decrease in the number of transients in the shadow of the Earth, right? So the sun's on the other side, you have a shadow. And Beatrice had never looked at that. And she does. And by gosh, it turns out that the number of transients, I think, drops by about 30% when you're in the shadow of the Earth. And the conclusion from all of that is these are objects likely in a geosynchronous orbit, staying over the same area during that 50-minute exposure, that are reflective. They're reflecting the sun, and that's why we see them on the photographic plates.
I really want to make sure that I understand this 30% thing, because it's one of the things that's been very confusing for my simple layman's brain in processing this. So just to dial in on that for a quick second, you looked at in this whole survey, which is from like November of 1949 to April of 1957, you find 107,000 some odd transients.
Yep.
And then when you apply this layer of looking for the Earth's shadow, calculating where the conical shadow of Earth would point out into space, you then see a reduction by about 30% within that shadow. Is that right? So wait, actually, let me get to a better question. Does that imply to you that of the total 107 something thousand, that about 30% are physical objects that are reflecting sunlight back? Do I have that right?
Yeah, so it would be that the 30% are clearly reflective objects that are not reflecting because they're in the Earth's shadow. Now, the other ones that are in the shadow, there may be some that are errors, identification errors, because there was an automated system that was used because, just too much data to go through manually.
Sure.
So this automated system was looking at objects that seemed to be transients. And in some cases, it does pick up dust on the plate or a scratch.
Mm-hmm.
And we haven't quantified exactly what that amount of erroneous identification is, but I know it's in there. So if there are transients that appear in the shadow, it may be that some of those are those errors. Mm-hmm. But it could also be that there are objects that are emitting light on their own. They're not even reflective, and that would still show up in the Earth's shadow.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah. People report fireballs. People report UAP emitting lights.
Yeah, and there's
We
no way to resolve this. We have no way. There's no other data we can use to figure that out exactly.
That's interesting.
Uh,
That was a question I was going to ask later about what do we do next. But maybe I'll
well,
punt on that for right now. But go
yeah.
ahead. Do you have something?
No, I was just going to say, so that paper really helps us feel confident that a big portion of the transients are actual very reflective objects that are probably in a geosynchronous orbit and doing things that you wouldn't expect by chance, like lining up in a line. So that's the presumption when we get to the nuclear paper is, yeah, these are real reflective objects in orbit,
Yeah, at
right?
least around 30% of these that disappear in the conical shadow, they basically have to be physical objects that are reflecting back in some way. Um,
Yes.
we spoke offline about the challenge here of the sort of conclusion being these things we're stuck with either like an extremely unusual explanation like UAP or an explanation no one's come up with yet. So can I just quickly ask, is it possible that there are some atmospheric effects that could disappear in Earth's shadow that would otherwise look like a pinpoint source of light? Is there anything that you've thought of that could potentially disappear in the shadow?
It would have to be, yeah. I mean, if you had an asteroid type thing in orbit around the Earth at the right height to where it looks like it's going to stay in one place relative to the stars when you do a 50-minute exposure. And if it was highly metallic and somehow so polished that it could reflect sunlight, that would also disappear when you get into the shadow of the sun, right? Shadow
Okay.
of the Earth, I mean.
But that is something that we have only seen a small handful of objects capable of meeting that description, right? In the course of like astronomical understanding of Earth. Like there are a few little sort of second moons or things that orbit Earth, but it's not 30,000.
No, and those objects don't tend to be uh, flat surfaces that are highly reflective because that just
Mm.
does not happen naturally.
And to draw this line for anybody who's somehow new to the UAP subject, but watching this UFO show anyway, there are many contemporaneous reports of metallic looking objects that do have flat surfaces like an oval bottom or something, your classic flying saucer type report. So it's
And nowadays you've got many satellites
mhm.
and space junk that would do this. But the key issue is that all of these photographs we're using were taken before the launch of the first human satellite, which was Sputnik in October of 1957.
So important. I really should have started us there. So if you looked at a picture of today's sky, would it look like a full plate of transients? Like you would have a ton of stars, but you would also have dozens of transients from the 11,000 odd satellites that we know of around Earth?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly why it's hard to do this research nowadays, is because there is so much up there that can cause reflections like that. But if you go back before the first human satellite, there shouldn't have been anything up there. It would have to be natural, which would mean it's kind of a meteor, asteroid, some object like that, that would have to be way more reflective than is plausible given what we know about objects like that.
Yeah, that's also not something we have found in the course of astronomical discovery. Like we didn't discover 30,000 asteroids floating around Earth sometime in the last 60 years, right? We would know about that.
Now, there have been small, I call them moonlets, I think, back in the 50s and 60s that were like what they thought were like small asteroid type objects that had been captured temporarily in
Mhm.
Earth's orbit, but they wouldn't be reflective like that.
Got it. Yeah, my understanding is that there are like a handful of these things. I also want to
Mhm.
double click on this thing we mentioned a couple times. Each of these plates represents one 50-minute exposure. Is that right? Just
Yes.
okay, cool. And then how many of the plates roughly did you go through that and have AI analyze for you? We talking like hundreds of thousands or like tens of thousands?
It gets a little complicated, but my understanding is that the plates, I think the plates are about, the size of a record album, an old LP cover.
Okay.
But what we're doing is looking at isolated sections of those plates a little at a time, so that in the images it's kind of enough of a close-up that you can actually see clearly what's going on in each area. So number of plates is not as relevant as the number of transients that we're seeing, which is about 107,000 that were identified in this automated system.
And of those, we think at least 30% must be objects that could reflect light from within a geosynchronous orbit.
Yes. Yeah, at least.
At least that many, right? And then I think you raise a really good point that it's totally possible that a bunch of the others are emitting light and that a bunch of the others are genuine defects in these plates: dust, scratches, emulsion, radiation. You mentioned gamma ray bursts, and you sort of ruled that out. Do you feel like any of these things could be gamma ray bursts?
So I'm not in a position to give you the details on that, but I know Beatriz has had that question raised with other publications on transients, and she has explained in those papers about the energy associated with gamma ray bursts and what it would look like on a plate, and the features of the transients as they are observed doesn't really match what you'd expect to see in a gamma ray burst. That's about as far as I can go on that one.
Okay. And similarly, we talked about this, but the meteors, I wanted to ask, did you, in going over any of these places, did you see some other non-star phenomena like a meteor? Like, did you catch a shooting star on any of these? Or, I mean, a 50-minute exposure, maybe a shooting star would not look like very much.
It would look like a streak.
Okay.
If it happened to be caught and was reflecting enough light, you just see a streak on the plate.
Okay.
So, I mean, that issue of these being point sources rather than streaks is absolutely critical.
Yeah.
Because it's saying that these objects are somehow managing to stay in the same position relative to the stars, even as the Earth moves.
Yeah. So that means they're moving, right? They're locked in, as you say, a geosynchronous orbit, right?
It could be. There was a scientist who pointed out to us that it could be in a lower than geosynchronous orbit if it was powered. They would have to use a lot of energy to go at the right speed to match the stars, but it is actually possible to do that. But it wouldn't be an unpowered object.
So in geosynchronous orbit, it could be non-powered because of the gravitational connection to Earth. Is that right?
Yeah, because basically once you get moving in space, you tend to stay going in that direction. So if you get in sufficient speed to hit that geosynchronous orbit, it will be able to stay there for quite a while.
Got it. You could coast.
Yes.
Turn your engines off if you have engines.
Yes.
And that's why it looks like a point relative to the stars as opposed to dragging across the sky, because it's in one place, but the stars are slowly moving as Earth spins.
Right.
So it has to be either... Well, basically it has to be moving, right? In order to look like a point, somewhat counterintuitively, it has to be moving. And the question would be, yeah, go ahead.
It has to be moving at the right speed.
Yeah, at the exact speed that sort of keeps it locked in with the constellations behind it. So that's either geosynchronous orbit or a like highly energy expensive maneuver below geosynchronous orbit.
Absolutely correct.
Which the utility of which is sort of, I don't know, hard to fathom. It would have to be essentially deceptive, I think. You would.
Well, let me say this. Natural objects would not have the power to be able to go at the right speed for lower than a geosynchronous orbit. Right. Yeah. An unpowered object is just not going to stay at the same speed as the stars. So you end up with that streak.
This is probably a no, but did you see anything that did look like an object that wasn't moving, that like would have drifted across? I guess an object that wasn't moving, like let's say a UFO, were parked somewhere, but it wasn't in geosynchronous orbit. Let's say it was like parked above the planet looking, but just kind of drifting, parked but not moving to the relative to the stars. Would that look like a streak?
Yes, it would. And I personally have not seen those. I think that the automated system that detected these was, kind of taught to not include those.
Okay.
Now, some may get in by accident, but I haven't personally seen that. And I think there's some aspects of this that you really have to consider, like when we're looking at alternative explanations, you also have to look at it in context of our findings in the second paper about associations with nuclear testing.
Great.
And if you want to, we can talk about that some too.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's hop right there. Okay, so the incidence goes up around 68% the day after a nuclear test of some kind. How many nuclear tests did you look at in that data?
There, I think between 1949 and 57, the time period we were looking at, I believe there were 128 above ground nuclear tests, most of them by the US and Soviet Union, a few in the latter part by Great Britain that were conducted in Australia. And so I want to make clear, there's in science, there's something that everybody could understand called a fishing expedition, right? I look at 10 different things and hope something shows an association. And those are less logically compelling if you don't have a reason to be expecting to see a relationship, because you're just, capitalizing on chance. So there was a book by a guy named Robert Hastings called UFOs and Nukes that is a excellent book about associations between UAP and nuclear tests and ICBM launch sites. All right. So I would recommend people check out that book if they want to know more about this.
It's a really deep dive. It's highly detailed. A lot of extremely credible people. I think he talked to over 160 people who saw something and work at these highly sensitive places where people have to be very serious and mentally healthy.
Yeah, and he was very happy to see our results because it kind of validates what he's been saying for years. And in that book, there's a particular chapter in there where they do talk about these anecdotal reports from people who were working on site where the nuclear tests were being conducted, where they had noted seeing UAP in the sky either just before, in some cases during, and many times after a nuclear test, right? So what we had was the anecdotal reports. And what we said was we have data, like if those transients are actually UAP that might come down from orbit after a nuclear test to observe something, then we would expect to see a statistical association between transients and the nuclear testing. Mm-hmm. So we had a reason specifically to say these should be more likely, the transients should be more likely to occur on the date surrounding a nuclear test. And we called it a nuclear window initially, which was 1 day before a test through 1 day after a test. Because the anecdotal reports said you could see them at any time there. And we first looked at that, and we found that there was a 45% increase in likelihood of seeing at least one transient if it was in that nuclear window compared to all other days. And when we submitted this to the journal Scientific Reports, one of the reviewers came back and said, this is too vague. It's weird to look at this window. You need to, dig down deeper and see when is an association actually occurring, if there is one. And I'm so happy that person asked us to do that, because it ended up with one of the most interesting findings in the paper, which is what you said, that there is if we look at 2 days before a test, 1 day before, day of, 1 day after, and 2 days after, only one of those is statistically significant. It's the association with 1 day after a nuclear test, which goes from 45% more likely to 68% more likely.
Wow.
I mean, that is the meat of the paper, is that there's this clear tendency of transients to appear presumably in orbit the day after a nuclear test. So,
and you cleared, I'm a layperson here, so I'm going to stumble and sound pretty stupid, but I think you cleared a 7 sigma rating on that finding. Is that right?
I don't think it's that much. It put it in terms of odds. It was an 8 chance out of 1,000 that this was just a chance occurrence, which is it's not absolute proof, but it is strong evidence. I don't normally think in terms of sigma like astronomers and physicists do. So I haven't converted it to that.
I barely know what it means. My loose understanding is it has to do with like the chance that something is chance, basically, that findings are an accident. And so there's a standard if you want to get above 5 sigma. A paper that I read today about your papers said you exceeded 7 sigma, which had come down from an initial 21. I have a follow-up question about specifically the stats. I'm wondering, did you do a statistical analysis on just the day after plates and re-ask the question about Earth's shadow to see if the percentage changed in terms of like how many transients disappeared?
No, we didn't. Those were two separate analyses. And actually, the data set we used for our nuclear study does not have all the information necessary to look at that. We had to do some pre-processing of this 107,000 transients to make it more manageable for analyzing what we wanted to look at.
Okay.
In theory, it might be possible to look at that, but we haven't. So I do think the other thing that's important is, we saw the association of transients with nuclear tests, but we also saw associations between transients, which are presumably in orbit, and UAP sightings from the ground. Now, it is not a huge association, but it is way beyond chance. So there is an actual link there in some way. And when I shared this with Beatriz, she immediately thought of a triangle. And at the corners of the triangle, you have transients, nuclear tests, UAP, and they're all interrelated. And I tried to find a way to analyze that in the data set. And what I ended up doing was creating this combined variable that simply was saying, I'll give the examples of both ends of that. So at the low end, where we expected to see the fewest transients, was on days that there were no UAP reported from the ground and there were no nuclear tests. Right. Mm-hmm. In the middle were days where there either was a UAP sighting or there was a nuclear test, not both. And then the last category was days where there were UAP sighted and there was a nuclear test. And results came out exactly like what I would expect, in that the no UAP, no nuclear test had the fewest number of transients, and then the number of transients more than doubled when you looked at a day when there were UAP and a nuclear test. Yeah. So it was just it was a way of linking together all three to say, yeah, these are all interrelated.
So this is probably a good place for a question for people who are approaching it without lots of UAP information and context, which is the natural question that my friends who are not read into this stuff asked, which is just like, how do you know you're not looking at some kind of effect of the nuclear testing? Like that, I think that would be the sort of intuitive explanation for people who don't have a context on UAP reporting. So it sounds to me like you've got some pretty good answers to that question. Would you like to run through a couple right now?
Sure, yeah. And preface this by saying there is no doubt that there is an association between transients, whatever they are, and the day after a nuclear test, right? So the question you're asking is, what's causing that? I think they even talked to Sean Kirkpatrick, the former head of Aero, in an article asking him to comment on our results. And he mentioned the same thing that a lot of other scientists mentioned, which is the transients are just a direct effect of the radioactivity associated with the nuclear blast. Now, that is a plausible thing to consider, but what you're saying is nuclear radiation that's just in the air after a nuclear blast, fallout. There was a lot of it in the air at that time. And if you're taking a photograph on an old photographic plate, radiation fogs photographs. But if the transients were due to the radiation associated with a nuclear blast, what you would see is the entire plate or sections of the plate would look cloudy. It's just kind of a fogging so that black no longer looks black. It looks a little bit white, but it's not a discrete point that you could draw a pencil line around. The transients don't look like fog. The transients look like point sources, exactly like a star, in some cases fairly large star. And that just does not fit the idea that it's radiation in the air. You and I were talking offline about this, but one of the reviewers for the journal said this could just be bomb debris, right? And I thought about it. It's like, okay, it could be. So let's say you've got a metal casing
Mhm.
around the bomb, it
Mhm.
blows up, and somehow some small pieces of that survive, and the nuclear blast itself shoots them into the sky, and somehow they get into orbit, right?
Mhm.
So again, it's the issue of what do transients look like, streaks or point sources? They look like point sources, which means they are traveling at exactly the right speed to look like they're staying in the same position relative to the stars, which requires being in geosynchronous orbit about 22,000 miles high. Now, I find it very implausible that a nuclear test, just by random chance, could blow a piece of bomb casing that somehow survived into orbit 22,000 miles away, just at the perfect speed to keep it in that orbit, right?
Mm.
That is, to me, less likely than intelligent life elsewhere in the universe.
Yeah.
It just seems like a very low probability event. But that's what would have to happen for bomb debris to account for this, right?
Yeah.
Other,
Yeah.
if it's in a lower orbit, it's just going to be a streak on the plate, and it wouldn't have been identified as a transient.
So it can't be bomb debris, or it's very unlikely to be bomb debris. It's very unlikely to just be radiation, because that would cause a fog of some kind. That would only leave some sort of atmospheric effect. I think you mentioned this in your paper and say, no, you include it in a list of potentials, but you also say no one has described or witnessed such an effect that would fit the category it would need to explain these transients. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes, there is something that is a well-known phenomenon called Cherenkov radiation, and it's when the energy of a nuclear reaction or something creates particles that are exceeding this or up to the speed of light in whatever material it's in. In water, light goes much slower than in the air. So what you see is that a nuclear reactor, if you have very hot nuclear materials in water, they glow. It's creating this Cherenkov radiation that makes it look like it's glowing. In the sky, it is possible to have such a thing happen in air, but the problem is the amount of energy. It would basically be high energy cosmic rays would be the only thing with enough energy to cause glowing in the sky related to this Cherenkov radiation type phenomenon. So yeah, it would. And if it were high energy cosmic rays, they wouldn't be associated with nuclear testing, right? With the dates of nuclear tests. So that doesn't account for why transients are statistically associated with nuclear tests. Now,
Man.
might there be some strange phenomenon that causes a distinct point of glowing in the sky that's related to nuclear tests, but doesn't occur the day of? It happens the day after a test. Is it possible? Maybe. I've never heard of anything like that. It just doesn't. There's the idea of something being parsimonious, an explanation
Mhm.
being
Mhm.
parsimonious, which just means that the simplest explanation that accounts for the facts is usually the correct one. Now, there are all these other explanations that possibly could account for what we're seeing, but they really are very unlikely and actually are harder to believe than the idea that transients might be artificial reflective objects in orbit.
Yeah. So I want to bounce this off you appropriately for reflective objects. That this thing happens in UAP studies, ufology, formerly ufology, frequently, where there's a list of potential explanations, and even though the sort of conventional explanations are extremely low probability, they get
Yeah.
kind of promoted up the probability chain because UAP as like non-human intelligence seems so unlikely, because basically there's no precedent demonstration that is in fact a real thing. So when we say like, oh, well, we've never seen a nuclear phenomenon that does this, people will respond, yeah, but we don't know that UFOs are non-human technology. Like we've never seen for sure a UFO. I think this is frustrating, and I think it's a place where people don't tend to think very clearly, where like there's a long tail of conventional explanations that get sort of nudged up the probability chain just because the most likely explanation seems so unlikely itself, like on its face. It's so difficult to accept. So we said offline, we're looking at this situation where there's like one pretty good potential explanation for these things, but it's really weird. Like, it would be revolutionary if that were in fact true. And all these other explanations have to compete with one explanation that would change our understanding of the nature of reality and our place in the cosmos. How does any of that bounce for you?
Yeah, I agree. That's an issue. And if you look at in some of the articles in magazines, newspapers that have been talking about these results, when they do interview other astronomers and other scientists to comment on it, what they are doing is pointing to those unlikely natural explanations and saying it's got to be due to that. Right? There's, not to get into arcane statistics, but there's a kind of statistics called Bayesian statistics. And one of the key elements of that is before you ever get any data from your experiment, what is the likelihood that an association exists based on what we know before we ever do the study? That Bayesian prior makes a huge difference on whether results after that are statistically significant or not. And what the commentators are doing is basically giving almost a zero probability that these are artificial objects in orbit prior to the first human satellite. And if you give them almost zero probability, it does make it harder to make a convincing argument that what we see is evidence supporting the idea that they are artificial objects. Now, if we go into that analysis, assuming that we have so much information from what people have reported in the past based on actual observations that, there's probably a 25% likelihood that these are artificial objects. That makes a huge difference in the statistical results you get. And I was told, Beatriz forwarded me something that a person online had posted about trying to use Bayesian statistics with our results, and found that the Bayesian results supported what we had reported, which is that there's a statistical association that's meaningful between day after nuclear tests and observations of transients.
Quick question that should have been earlier. Where did you use, what data did you draw on to determine which days had UAP reports?
That was a tough issue because there are many databases available. Most of them didn't start collecting data until like the 60s, late 50s, 60s, 70s. That's not the period we're interested in. So we had to try to go to a data set that had systematic data on UAP between 1940, 1949 and 1957. Excuse me. The only one of those that we could find that was the most comprehensive was what's called UFO-CAT. And it's maintained by the Center for UFO Studies in Chicago area by Mark Roediger, who is one of Alan Hynek's proteges. So he's still around. He's still updating this database. And if you want to access it, you can pay them their fee, and he will personally write you with access to the data set, which is what we did. It's an old database and it's messy. It actually started with the Condon Committee. That was where it was first created back in the 60s for the Air Force study in UAP that had very controversial findings. But anyway, that's the set we used. And as a courtesy, after we got these results, I wrote Mark Roediger and I said, hey, he's a statistician. And I said, hey, look at what we did with your data. What do you think of this? He gave us the thumbs up and signed off on the statistics, which made me feel a little more comfortable.
Cool. Okay, so moving into our goodbye phase, and circling back through this Bayesian point that you made, one of the reasons this research that you've just done seems so promising and exciting and valuable to me is that it can potentially be a building block for better Bayesian priors in the future. So
right,
it can start us off on this like actual data-based footing of like, this is what we could expect to see in the sky, like, some 30,000 odd UFO type things over a 7-year period. So I'm excited to ask what you're hoping to see from research in the future and what, if anything, you'd like to work on yourself.
I've had a lot of requests for the data, and it's very clear that there are, I don't know, probably 20 people already that are interested in trying to replicate this, maybe test other issues related to it. Any of those people possibly might find something that we didn't see. They may look at other data sets. I don't know. But that's pretty cool because that's the way science is supposed to work. You get peer review, you publish it, and then other people build on that, critique it, get extensions from it. So personally, I think what Beatrice and I are interested in is a couple of things. One is trying to use AI type stuff to clean the data and get rid of some of those transients that are mistaken identifications, the dust, the smudges, the emulsion defects. I think that can be done. And actually, somebody reached out to me just yesterday, having read this paper that was saying, hey, we could do this. So that would be one interesting thing. And what that should do is by eliminating noise, it should make any relationships between transients and any other thing we're looking at stronger, make the signal stronger, which would be a huge advantage for us. Now, all of the data so far for the transients that we used in this study were from the Mount Palomar Observatory in California. There are other observatories that have the same type of images taken from other places around the world. For example, the Vatican Observatory that goes back that far. Those plates, as far as we know, are not scanned and available publicly, but with some money and effort, we're hoping that we might be able to find other observatories around the world that have data from that 1949 to 57 period where we could independently replicate these associations using an entirely different data set. If we did that and we basically get the same type of finding, that would be huge evidence in support that these are real objects, with real relationships. Beyond that, it would be awesome if we could do it with modern skies, but it's very complicated because there are so many objects in the sky. You have to account for all the space trash and satellites, and you have to account for all of that and basically remove them from the picture and be able to see whether there are still things like transients anymore.
Yeah, that might be impossible. Certainly, it would involve a ton of AI.
Yeah.
Oh, I have one more weird little side question. I think I heard you mention in another interview that the data changed in the last year. Is that right? Did something shift in 1957?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So yes, what we saw was once the nuclear testing picked up, we started seeing associations with transients from about 1950, I think, through 1956, right? And I looked just out of curiosity. I said, well, when was the last time we saw a transient coincide with a nuclear test? And it turned out it was a year before our data set ended, which means there were still like 25 nuclear tests that didn't show the association with transients at all, even though nothing else had changed. So it was restricted to this one period. And just coincidentally, I had read a paper by a guy named Larry Hancock and some colleagues with the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies who'd done a systematic analysis of UAP sightings at nuclear production facilities. Guess what? They were seen regularly starting in about 47 all the way till about 1954, and then they totally stopped. They didn't see any more of them. And that's something between 54 and 56. If we assume that these are artificial objects that were actually showing curiosity about nuclear tests, something shifted and they were no longer interested in that 54 to 56 period. So I don't know what happened. It's pure speculation. I love somebody made a comment online, and I'm not endorsing this, but they said, I know exactly what caused it. That was when Eisenhower made the treaty with the NHI.
Yeah.
So they didn't need to monitor our nuclear tests anymore.
Yeah.
I thought that was pretty funny.
I will embarrassedly admit that I was thinking that, but I was not going to say it because you're a scientist. I didn't want to be weird and rude.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I thought that was a funny explanation.
It does occur to me also that if you took those years that they apparently weren't interested anymore out of your data set, you might find an even higher statistical incidence of appearance the next day.
Yeah, but it's also cherry picking the data after the fact, and you're not really supposed to do that.
No, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Well, this has just been super fantastic. I'm deeply appreciative of you sharing some time. I'm sure you're getting snowballs left and right from people who want to hear the gritty details. And I'm just so grateful for you sharing some of your really special work here, man. I think you're going to get cited into antiquity on this one. I think you've earned a place in science fame.
I think it's really funny. So I've done science for years. I've got over 200 publications, and I know probably no more than 100 people have read any one of those, right? So we published this thing a week ago, and right now, I think the number is almost 70,000 reads.
Nice.
It's like, this is the most impactful research of my career, even though it was done for free on nights and weekends. I mean, it blows me away.
Well, that's really cool. You're blowing us away with your findings. Thank you so much, Doctor. It's been really great to meet you, Steve, and I hope you have a great day.
Yep. Thank you. I appreciate it.
And that's the show. Thank you for listening. If you're enjoying it, please like and subscribe and share this with people who you think might like it. You could also directly support us at patreon.com/WTUFO for $1 a month. We do some chatting in there, and you can propose questions for future episodes. You could also check out spacefair.etsy.com. That's our company's main merch site, where you could support us commercially and pick up some cool gear. Thank you again for listening. Hope you have a lovely day.